What if I told you that a beautiful, intelligent Duchess was executed not because she actually committed adultery with 20 men, but because her husband needed an excuse to get rid of her? What if I told you that one of the most famous queens in English history wasn't actually guilty of the crimes that sent her to the chopping block? Today we're diving into the tragic story of Anne Boleyn, the woman whose rumoured passion became the weapon used to destroy her. Before we get into this incredible story, if you're fascinated by the dark secrets of history, hit that like button and subscribe. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It's amazing how we can all connect across the world over these stories from centuries ago. Anne Boleyn's name has become synonymous with scandal, seduction, and betrayal. But the real story is far more complex and heartbreaking than the myths would have you believe. This isn't just another tale of royal intrigue. It's the story of how a powerful man systematically destroyed a woman's reputation to justify murder when she could no longer give him what he wanted. Let's go back to where it all began. Anne Boleyn wasn't born to be queen. She was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious courtier who understood that in Tudor England, your daughters were your most valuable assets. Anne spent her teenage years in France, serving in the household of Queen Claude. This wasn't just finishing school. It was an education in the most sophisticated court in Europe, where she learned to dress, speak, and move like royalty. When Anne returned to England around 1522, she was about 21 years old, and unlike any woman the English court had ever seen. She had dark hair and eyes in a court that prized fair features. She was witty and sharp-tongued in an era when women were expected to be quiet and demure. She could debate theology and politics with the most educated men at court, and she absolutely refused to become just another royal mistress. That last part is what made her different. You see, King Henry VIII was already married to Catherine of Aragon, and he had a long history of taking mistresses from among the court ladies. Anne's own sister Mary had been one of them. Most women in Anne's position would have been honoured to catch the king's eye, even temporarily. But Anne had seen what happened to discarded mistresses. They got a few gifts, maybe a minor marriage arrangement, and then they were forgotten. Anne wanted more. She wanted everything, and somehow, impossibly, she got it. Henry's obsession with Anne began around 1526. He was already unhappy in his marriage. Catherine had failed to give him a male heir, and at 41 she was past childbearing age. But his attraction to Anne went beyond just finding a new wife. He was consumed by her in a way that he had never been consumed by anyone before, and Anne, brilliant strategist that she was, kept him at arm's length for 6 years. Think about that. For 6 years, the most powerful man in England pursued a woman who refused to sleep with him. She danced with him, flirted with him, exchanged letters with him, but she would not become his mistress. Her price was marriage, and nothing less would do. The more Anne refused, the more desperate Henry became. He convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine had been cursed by God, because Catherine had briefly been married to his dead brother. He started annulment proceedings with the Pope. When the Pope refused, Henry did something that changed English history forever. He broke with the Catholic Church entirely and declared himself the head of a new Church of England. Let that sink in. Henry VIII literally created a new religion because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. He tore England away from 1,000 years of Catholic tradition. He dissolved monasteries, seized church lands, and executed anyone who opposed him, including his own former Chancellor Thomas More, all because of his obsession with one woman. Finally, in January 1533, Henry married Anne in secret. She was already pregnant. In June, she was crowned Queen of England in a ceremony of unprecedented magnificence. After 6 years of waiting, she had achieved the impossible. She was Queen of England. But there was one problem. The child she was carrying, the child that was supposed to justify everything Henry had done, turned out to be a girl. They named her Elizabeth. And while Henry tried to hide his disappointment, everyone at court could see it. He needed a son, and Anne had failed him. Still, they tried again. Anne got pregnant multiple times over the next 2 years, but each pregnancy ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. The final blow came in January 1536, when Anne miscarried a male child. She had been about 15 weeks pregnant, far enough along that everyone could see it had been a boy. That miscarriage was Anne's death sentence, though she didn't know it yet. Henry's obsession had turned to cold calculation. He had destroyed his relationship with the Catholic Church for this woman. He had alienated powerful allies and divided his kingdom. And what did he have to show for it? 1 daughter and a string of dead babies. Worse, Henry had already noticed someone else. Jane Seymour was everything Anne was not. Quiet, pale, submissive. And most importantly, she came from a family known for producing sons. Henry wanted Jane, but there was an obvious problem. He was already married to Anne, and he couldn't exactly ask the Pope for another annulment after creating an entire church to avoid the first one. So Henry needed another solution. He needed Anne gone, and he needed it to look justified. He needed her reputation destroyed so thoroughly that no one would question her execution, and that's when the accusations against Anne Boleyn read like something out of a fever dream. According to the official indictment, she had committed adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother. She had conspired to murder the king. She had used witchcraft to make Henry fall in love with her. She had mocked the king's poetry and laughed at his clothes. The list went on and on, each accusation more desperate than the last. But the centerpiece of the charges was the claim that Anne had been sexually involved with multiple men at court. The official number varied depending on who was telling the story, but it eventually settled on 5 specific men. Mark Smeaton, a court musician; Henry Norris, the king's closest friend; William Brereton, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber; Francis Weston, another courtier; and most shockingly, her own brother George Boleyn. The story that emerged was that Anne was a woman of insatiable sexual appetite who had been cuckolding the king practically since their wedding night. According to the charges, she had seduced these men, promised them favors, and even plotted with them to kill Henry so she could marry one of her lovers. Now, let's be clear about something. These charges were absolute nonsense. We know they were nonsense because we can trace exactly how they were manufactured, who created them, and why. But in 1536, when Anne stood accused, the truth didn't matter. What mattered was that the king wanted her gone, and everyone around him scrambled to make it happen. The architect of Anne's destruction was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister. Cromwell was a bureaucratic genius who understood better than anyone how power actually worked in Tudor England. He had helped Henry break with Rome, and he had helped establish Anne as queen. But now Anne had become a political liability, and Cromwell knew that his own position depended on removing her. Cromwell needed confessions. He started with the weakest target, Mark Smeaton, a musician of common birth who had risen at court through Anne's patronage. Smeaton was arrested on April 30th and probably tortured, though the records are vague on this point. What we know for certain is that after several hours in Cromwell's custody, Smeaton confessed to adultery with the Queen. That single confession was all Cromwell needed. On May 1st, during a jousting tournament, Henry suddenly stood up and left without a word. Anne watched him go, probably confused but not yet afraid. She had no idea that Smeaton had just destroyed her. The next day, Anne was arrested at Greenwich Palace. She was taken by boat to the Tower of London, the same fortress where she had stayed before her coronation just 3 years earlier. As she arrived, she reportedly collapsed, asking the constable of the tower repeatedly what she was accused of. When she heard the charges, she actually laughed. She thought it was so absurd that surely it would be cleared up quickly. But the arrests didn't stop with Anne. Over the next few days, Norris, Weston, Brereton and George Boleyn were all arrested and taken to the Tower. These weren't random courtiers. Norris was Henry's closest companion, the man who slept in the next room to the king. Brereton was connected to powerful families in Wales. Weston came from wealth and influence, and George Boleyn was Anne's own brother, a rising star at court. The trials were a farce. In Anne's case, the prosecution tried to prove she had committed adultery by citing specific dates and locations, but many of these dates were provably wrong. For example, they claimed she had slept with Norris at Westminster in October 1533, but court records show Anne was at Greenwich that entire month. They said she had been with Weston at Whitehall on a specific date when Weston wasn't even at court. The most grotesque charge was the one involving her brother. The prosecution claimed that George and Anne had committed incest multiple times, and that Anne had even joked about whether her daughter Elizabeth might actually be George's child. This charge was so shocking that even in an era accustomed to scandal, people were horrified. But it was also the most obviously false. The Boleyns were an ambitious family, but incest would have destroyed everything they had worked for. The evidence against George was particularly flimsy. The main proof was a conversation where Anne had allegedly told George that Henry was impotent. During the trial, the judges presented this information on a piece of paper that George was instructed not to read aloud because it would embarrass the king. George, in an act of defiance, read it aloud anyway. He figured if he was going to be executed, he might as well tell the truth. That yes, Anne had worried about Henry's sexual problems, but that was hardly evidence of incest. None of the other men confessed except Smeaton. Norris refused to confess even when promised his life would be spared. Weston protested his innocence to the end. Brereton barely defended himself at all, possibly because he was too stunned by the absurdity of it all. George Boleyn gave such a brilliant defense that observers thought he might actually be acquitted. But the verdict was never in doubt. This wasn't about justice. It was about removing obstacles to the king's new marriage. On May 15th, the 4 men were executed. Norris, Weston, Brereton and George Boleyn were taken to Tower Hill and beheaded. Smeaton, because he was a commoner, was hanged. Before he died, Norris still refused to confess, even though a confession might have saved his life. 2 days later, on May 17th, it was Anne's turn to face her accusers. She was tried in the Tower's Great Hall before a jury of peers. Among the judges was her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who voted for her death. Also present was Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, who had once been engaged to Anne before the king took an interest in her. Percy reportedly became so ill during the trial that he had to leave. Anne defended herself brilliantly. She refuted the charges point by point, showing how the dates didn't match and the locations were wrong. She pointed out that she had been pregnant or recovering from childbirth during many of the alleged encounters. She reminded the court that she had been under constant supervision as queen, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who never left her side. When could she possibly have conducted all these affairs? But none of it mattered. The jury took barely 15 minutes to return a guilty verdict. Anne was sentenced to be burned or beheaded at the king's pleasure. Henry, in a final act of mercy that was really just cruelty disguised as kindness, decided she would be beheaded. But not with the traditional English axe. He sent for a special swordsman from Calais, supposedly because a sword was more merciful than an axe. The truth was probably that Henry didn't want Anne's execution to be botched. English executioners with axes sometimes needed multiple blows to complete the job. It was messy, brutal, and undignified. Henry wanted Anne's death to be quick and clean, not because he cared about her suffering, but because he cared about appearances. Anne spent her final days in the Tower in a strange state of alternating calm and hysteria. Her conversations with her attendants were recorded, and they reveal a woman trying desperately to make sense of her fate. She joked that people would remember her by saying, "La Rouen Anne sans tête," Queen Anne without a head. She worried about what would happen to her daughter Elizabeth. She swung between protesting her innocence and accepting her fate as God's judgment. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne dressed carefully in a grey gown with a white collar, her hair tucked under a white cap. She was taken to a scaffold that had been specially erected on Tower Green. Unlike most executions, which were public spectacles on Tower Hill, Anne's execution was kept relatively private. Only about 200 people were allowed to attend, mostly officials and courtiers. Anne gave a short speech before her death. She didn't protest her innocence directly. To do so would have been seen as criticizing the king's justice and could have brought consequences for her family. Instead, she spoke carefully, saying she came here to die according to law, and she would not accuse anyone or speak of the reasons she was condemned. She praised the king as a gentle and merciful prince, asked people to pray for him, and requested that they pray for her soul. Then she knelt down, and one of her ladies tied a blindfold over her eyes. Anne was terrified that even now, at the last moment, something would go wrong. She kept repeating, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul," over and over, apparently worried that she might still be alive when her head was cut off. The French swordsman had hidden his sword in the straw so Anne wouldn't see it and panic. He walked to one side and called out, "Bring me the sword," as a distraction. As Anne turned her head toward his voice, he grabbed his sword and in one swift motion cut her head from her body. She died instantly. She was probably about 35 years old. Here's something that will make your blood run cold. While Anne was being executed, Henry was already in Wiltshire with Jane Seymour. The very next day, May 20th, he became officially engaged to Jane. 10 days after Anne's death, on May 30th, Henry married Jane in a quiet ceremony. He had been so eager to move on that he couldn't even wait a month after murdering his wife. But the truly sickening part is what happened to Anne's reputation after her death. Henry didn't just want Anne dead, he wanted her erased. He had her portraits destroyed or painted over. He removed her heraldic symbols from palaces. He forbade anyone to speak her name. And most cruelly of all, he declared his marriage to Anne invalid from the beginning, which meant that their daughter Elizabeth was now illegitimate, a bastard with no claim to the throne. Think about that. Henry claimed he broke with Rome and created the Church of England because his marriage to Catherine was invalid. Then he executed Anne for adultery committed within their marriage. But then he declared that marriage invalid too. Which was it? If the marriage wasn't valid, then Anne couldn't have committed adultery against him. But if the marriage was valid, then he couldn't remarry without committing bigamy. The logical contradictions didn't matter to Henry. What mattered was getting what he wanted. And he wanted Jane Seymour and the son he was convinced she would give him. For a brief moment, Henry got his wish. Jane did give him a son, the future Edward VI. But she died just 12 days after giving birth, probably from an infection. Some people saw it as divine judgment. Henry had murdered Anne to marry Jane, and Jane died giving him the son Anne couldn't provide. So what really happened to Anne Boleyn? The truth is that she almost certainly didn't commit adultery with anyone, let alone 5 men. The evidence against her was manufactured, the confessions were coerced or fabricated, and the whole trial was a show designed to give legal cover to judicial murder. But why has the myth persisted for nearly 500 years? Why do people still debate whether Anne really slept with all those men? I think it's because the myth serves a purpose. If Anne really was guilty, then her execution was justified. Henry was just a king doing what he had to do to maintain order and legitimacy. The whole thing becomes a morality tale about the dangers of female sexuality and ambition. But if we accept the truth that Anne was innocent, then we have to confront something much more disturbing. We have to acknowledge that a man created an entire religion so he could marry a woman, then murdered that woman when she failed to give him what he wanted. We have to acknowledge that the Tudor court, which we romanticize in movies and TV shows, was actually a place where anyone could be destroyed on fabricated charges if they became inconvenient to the king. Anne Boleyn's real crime wasn't adultery. It was failure. She failed to provide a male heir, and in Henry's eyes, that made her useless. Everything else, the charges of adultery, witchcraft, conspiracy, were just window dressing designed to make her execution look legitimate. The saddest part of this story is that Anne's daughter Elizabeth eventually became one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth Vi ruled for 45 years, defeating the Spanish Armada, fostering an age of exploration and culture, and turning England into a major European power. Anne died believing she was a failure because she only gave Henry a daughter. She never knew that her daughter would achieve more than any of Henry's children, including the son he wanted so desperately. Anne Boleyn wasn't a saint. She was ambitious, sometimes ruthless, and willing to play dangerous games for power. But she didn't deserve to die. She deserved better than to have her reputation destroyed by lies and her memory erased by a man who claimed to love her. Her story isn't just about royal scandal. It's about how power can corrupt absolutely, how reputation can be weaponized, and how history is often written by people with something to hide. 500 years later, we're still talking about Anne Boleyn. We're still trying to understand what really happened to her and why. And maybe that's her final victory. Henry wanted her erased, but we haven't forgotten her. We remember her not as the monster he tried to make her into, but as a real person who lived, loved, made mistakes, showed courage, and died with dignity, even when dignity was all she had left.